we found a very interesting book titled Civilized One, The World Is Not As You Thought It Was. One of the biggest breakthroughs of all time. This is the definitive proof that civilization is thousands of years older than historians believe. Colin Wilson. This book is by Christopher Knight, co-author of the bestseller The Hiram Key, and Alan Butler. Civilization 1, The World Is Not As You Thought It Was, by Christopher Knight, 1950. Publication date 2004. We found this in the public domain, public access. So, no copyright infringement was intentional, and we bring it to all through this video as a review for educational purposes alone. And underneath this particular book, on this web page, it reads, "This is the extraordinary story of how a quest to try to crack the mystery of the megalithic yard, an ancient unit of linear measurement, led to the discovery of compelling evidence pointing to the existence of an unknown, highly advanced culture which was the precursor to the earliest known civilizations such as the Sumerians and the Egyptians. There must have been a civilization 1. The Great Wall of History, the turning Earth, the harmony of the spheres, Sumerian degrees, the rebirth of the metric system, and much more content within this book." So let's get reading. I'm going to enlarge it so you can read along. Civilization 1, The World Is Not As You Thought It Was. On the inside sleeve, "This is the extraordinary story of how a quest to try to crack the mystery of the megalithic yard, an ancient unit of linear measurement." I think we've already read that. "Knight and Butler reveal the secrets of a remarkable integrated measuring system which might have been lost to the world forever. It was a system far more advanced than anything used today, and it forms the basis of both the imperial and metric measuring systems. These ancient scientists understood the dimensions, motions, and relationships of the Earth, Moon, and Sun. They measured the solar system and even understood how the speed of light was integrated into the movements of our planet. Their conclusions fly in the face of everything that we thought we knew about the origins of the modern world, but the evidence is incontrovertible, and the implications of these revelations go far beyond the fascination of the discovery of a super science of prehistory. They indicate a grand plan which will have far-reaching theological ramifications." There's other books by this author and previous books by Alan Butler, and there's information about Christopher Knight and Alan Butler. Contents, appendices and index, plates, dedications, and there would have been a CD of megalithic music composed and performed by Delirion to accompany this book. Samples of Civilization 1, the album, can be heard in copies bought at this website here, if it's still up and running. You may find it online somewhere. You can listen to it. Acknowledgements. Introduction. The superculture. Was there a super advanced culture in prehistory? If not, how can it be that the supposedly unsophisticated people of Stone Age Britain possessed a fully integrated system of measurement based on a deep understanding of the solar system? The history of human development from hunter-gatherer to city dwellers once seemed comfortable and predictable. All of the available evidence supported the accepted picture of a smooth social evolution, largely driven by the ingenuity of people living in the Middle East. But then, over several decades, an eminent professor of engineering, Alexander Thom, annoyed the world of archaeology by making a startling claim. He maintained that he had found that the structures left by late Stone Age man had been built using a standard unit of measure that was so precise that he could identify its central value to an accuracy that was less than the width of a human hair. The idea that these simple people from prehistory could have achieved such accuracy flew in the face of all the worldview of most archaeologists. Not surprisingly, Thom's findings were almost universally dismissed as some kind of mistake. Professor Thom called his discovered unit the megalithic yard, but he died in 1985 without ever being able to explain why people from the Neolithic period or late Stone Age, circa around about 3500 BC, might have been motivated to establish such a measure, or how they could have consistently reproduced such incredible accuracy. Even today, there are many tens of thousands of these megalithic stone structures strewn across the British Isles and the western fringes of Europe. Our initial quest was simple. The author's initial quest was simple. Wanted to find out if Thom really had found a prehistoric measure, or if he had been deluded by the huge amount of data he collected from a surveying of sites from the islands of northern Scotland down to Brittany on the west coast of France. The authors reasoned that if Thom's megalithic yard was imaginary, it should be a meaningless value, but if it was indeed a genuine Neolithic measure, it should have some physical reality behind it and some kind of scientific means of reproduction. The consequences of knowledge. The author's investigation led them to a rediscovery of the science behind this prehistoric unit, and they could now demonstrate both its mathematical origin and its means of reproduction, using the mass and spin of the earth. In identifying the precise origin of Thom's megalithic yard, however, these authors soon found that they had nudged open the door of a virtual treasure chest of lost knowledge. Their approach had been to apply forensic techniques to archaeology across the span of cultures from prehistory before 3000 BC and the earliest times of written history after 3000 BC. They had found that there was a completely identifiable DNA associated with the oldest and purest system of science that appeared in the most unexpected places. Even units of measure that are believed to be relatively modern, from the pound and the pint to the gram and the litre, turned out to be thousands of years old and linked to the very dimensions of the solar system. The authors tried to keep their story as short as clear as possible within this book. A basic knowledge of arithmetic is all that is required to follow their investigation in detail. So please have your calculator on hand if you wish to check out their findings step by step, or check their findings step by step. Additional information, frequently asked questions and new developments are available on their website www.civilization1.com if it's still up and running. If you feel comfortable with the old idea that human development was a smooth evolutionary journey from ignorant caveman to urban sophisticate, be prepared to be shocked. The world is not what you thought it was. It's not what you think it is. Chapter 1. The Great Wall of History. The invention of writing. Forget the wheel. It was the invention of writing that changed our world forever. The first wheels were used for turning clay pots and were later attached to axles to improve the efficiency of moving across dry ground for agriculture and warfare. This certainly helped in the production of food and aided its distribution to the growing communities that became the earliest cities. But major movements of people and goods relied mainly on sea lanes and inland waterways for thousands of years. The use of writing, however, had an immediate effect on commerce and trade. Some of the earliest documents created were concerned with ships, manifests, and other documents of trade. Lunar calendars existed from as early as 20,000 BC, carved on bone or antler, but real writing developed extremely quickly in Sumer and Egypt around 3000 BC. It was this ability to record information without relying on the honesty and memory of others that really drove mankind forward to begin an age that we defined as the beginning of civilization around about 3200 BC. The first great breakthrough in communication had happened nearly 2 million years earlier than when our distant ancestors, Homo erectus, developed a larynx position lower in the throat than other primates. This piece of evolution cost these creatures the ability to breathe and drink at the same time, but it allowed them to generate a far wider range of sounds than had previously been possible. With a vocabulary of thousands of discernible sounds, spoken language is thought to have developed very quickly. The simplest form of vocal communication may have been a hunting ploy, for example, to imitate the sound of an animal and then point to its direction. Over time, true language developed as abstract sounds were used to represent objects and actions and then assembled into sentences to express complex issues, such as human emotions. Language allowed for information to be passed on from one person to another, but the next stage of development was to make a record of human knowledge and experience by drawing a representation of the subject matter. We can see that the drawings on the walls of prehistoric caves are a kind of proto-writing. Any mark that records a specific meaning, either to the originator or to others, can fairly be called basic writing. The first writing systems were made up of hieroglyphs, which were used like a cartoon strip of pictures to contain information. These early writing methods came into use just over 5,000 years ago and slowly developed into abstract notation, where the marks have a meaning that can only be understood by those people trained in the process of encodement and decodement reading. But it seems that sophisticated meaning has been communicated by writing for a great deal longer than has been thought. Dr. Michael Rappengluck of the University of Munich has shown how a 16,000-year-old drawing of a horse in the caves at Lascaux in France is actually a carefully recorded lunar calendar. And it has a website here, bbc.co. You can look at that and then probably go have a look at it if it's still up. What at first view looks like a very attractive drawing of a horse is now thought to be a means of keeping track of the phases of the moon. This surely qualifies as writing. This level of intelligence in Paleolithic what the hell's that word? Paleolithic man is hardly surprising. As a species, Homo sapiens has not changed significantly, either mentally or physically, for well over 100,000 years. We may have moved from the Stone Age to the Internet Age, but each human being is no different today to their forebear 500 generations in the past. We must also remember that while most of us have lives that have been shaped by the technological revolution, there are some groups of people around the world who still live as simple hunter-gatherers in a genuinely Stone Age existence. For example, some Australian Aborigines and tribes in some parts of South America. The remarkable Sumerians. Given that speech has been around for so long, it would be surprising if communication through drawn symbols only arrived so very recently. The earliest form of writing that is generally accepted as such emerged more or less at the same time as the wheel. Both were invented by the remarkable Sumerian people, or Sumerians, who arrived in the land now known as Iraq from an unknown location more than 5,000 years ago. The Egyptians devised the earliest hieroglyphic system very shortly afterwards, probably within 200 years, just when Upper and Lower Egypt were united into a single kingdom. But then eventually because they had a Semitic style of writing, however the Semites wrote, was it left to right or right to left? They actually changed it. They developed a Demotic script, and they used that. Probably having association with these Sumerians, these Mesopotamians, trade, commerce, etc. Right? So they helped them develop a better form of language and writing, because cuneiform was good, wedge-shaped writing on clay tablets, but it probably got complicated, became complicated. Only those who are really well versed in it didn't have those difficulties, supposedly. The so-called cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, characters developed by the Sumerians were made by pressing wedge-shaped sticks into wet clay. These Sumerian tablets may look rather unimpressive to us today, but these talking patterns were thought to have powerful magic by ordinary people. Did the Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, 3,000 years older than the Bible or more, come before those Sumerian tablets? Who knows? Do the research to find out. At first, the content of these documents was very basic, but as time went by, improvements added layers of sophistication until around 800 BC, when the Greeks created a full alphabetic writing system that finally separated consonants from vowels. The period immediately before these early records were left by the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians has become a virtual wall, separating what we call history from everything that happened before, which we label prehistory. Everything that occurred before the advent of true writing is now considered to be myth and legend, because every piece of human knowledge had to be transmitted by word of mouth from generation to generation. The Great Wall of History. This wall effect actually says a great deal more about current thinking than it does about the people who occupied our world before history began. Being human, we tend to view ourselves and our society as being somehow definitive, the measure of rightness by which to gauge others. During the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries, there was an egocentric worldview in academia, whereby white Christian male explorers would travel to see the inferior races who did not live properly. One English naturalist wrote of his disdain for a group in Tierra del Fuego who shouted at him from a canoe. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. We often try to imagine what pleasures in life some of the lower animals can enjoy. How much more reasonably the same questions may be asked concerning these barbarians. These were the words of the young Charles Darwin, a man who went on to realize how all humanity has sprung from lower animals. That's what he was trying to put across. Today, academia is much more objective and less judgmental than in previous generations, but the ideal of anything approaching real empathy is frequently as distant as it ever was for much of archaeology. But, we would argue, if we really want to bring into finer focus the landscape that lies beyond the Great Wall of History, we must undergo something of a fundamental shift in our mindset. The subject matter of this book requires readers to open their minds to a softer, more yielding worldview that dissolves preconceptions and temporarily allows the mind to roam freely over the subject matter, thereby allowing consideration of possibilities that might otherwise be missed. The principle that appears to underpin standard academia these days can reasonably be called stepping stone logic, where deductions are often only encouraged in a strictly linear fashion. By this mode of reasoning, one can only proceed by confirming each step before looking for an incremental way forward. While it sounds entirely sensible, it can blind the researcher to factors that are outside their expectations. Albert Einstein is famously said to have observed that imagination is more important than knowledge. Surely the great man has to be right. True insights come from thinking outside the box rather than simply ticking procedural boxes in a neat row. A very famous archaeologist once said to Allen, one of his authors, that all of his findings must be dismissed because his starting point was, in his opinion, wrong. How foolish. Even if someone does start with an error, it is entirely possible that subsequent discoveries could be right if validated without reliance on the original premise. The mode of reasoning that we invite you, these authors invite you, the reader, to adopt while reading this book is one they call the TP method. This is a multi-dimensional approach to logical deduction, rather than a classical linear stepping stone process. It simply requires that each piece of evidence is seen in its own right and is not forced to conform to any preconceived notion of what should be. Even where different elements of evidence appear to be mutually exclusive, we suggest, or the authors suggest, that they should be allowed to coexist until the time comes for a final analysis. With the TP method, each strand of evidence is considered to be a potential supporting stick, and only if there are eventually enough of them that work together does the argument stand. The authors believe that this is the only approach to examining the distant past that is likely to produce a cogent picture, one that does not pick and choose which facts it prefers to accept as real. Quote, real, unquote. As they conducted their research, there were many occasions where they felt the urge to reject a finding as a coincidence because it did not fit with what they expected to see. They suspended their judgment and eventually, as a new picture emerged, were very glad that they had not tried to force their preconceptions on the evidence. Any readers who feel unable to open their minds right up at this point should close the book now. The ancient Egyptians. The Great Wall of History has distorted the way most people view the past by telescoping events so that the ancient Egyptian civilization is often thought of as being extremely distant, whereas in terms of the span of the existence of our fully developed species, it was actually extremely recent. The huge array of artifacts and records left by the ancient Egyptians provides a wonderfully strong picture of their lives and achievements. We know the names of kings right back to King Menes, who unified the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt in approximately 3100 BC and ruled from the capital of Memphis at the head of the Nile Delta. This great civilization left us beautiful structures such as the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, and we can medically examine the physical remains of Egypt's rulers and leading citizens, carefully preserved by skillful mummification. Archaeologists have estimated that the Egyptians embalmed huge numbers of bodies. Though seeming to be a massive number, some claim that as many as 730 million people may have been mummified between the time of King Menes and the 7th century AD, when the practice was ended. There's a couple of websites down here. Footnote 2, nabatea.net, items Hotmail, and 3, math, Buffalo Education, mad, etc., etc. Can probably have a look at those. Although many mummies have not survived the scorching heat of northern Africa, it is believed that several million are preserved in yet to be discovered tombs and burial places. As recently as June 1999, a burial ground containing almost 10,000 mummies was discovered near the town of Bawiti, southwest of Cairo. We know that these people ate with whom they traded, as well as when and against whom they went to war. One 5,000-year-old Egyptian mace head contains a record of a great victory in which no less than 120,000 prisoners were taken, together with 400,000 oxen and 1,422,000 goats that were liberated from the enemy. King Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, was even kind enough to leave us a dismantled boat that has now been rebuilt. As a result, we can be sure that the Egyptians used only wood, rope, reeds and the like for their craft, which contained no metal. Yeah, all they really had was copper. Eventually had copper for weapons, and they're pretty crap. Even their tools are crap. They didn't last long compared to iron or metal ones. These people also left detailed records of their gods, little g, and their religious practices. The famous Book of the Dead is a large collection of funerary texts from various dates containing magical formulae, hymns and prayers believed by the ancient Egyptians to guide and protect the soul of the deceased on its journey into the land of the dead. The texts tell us of a belief that happiness in the afterlife was dependent on having led a life in keeping with their principle known as ma'at, which meant doing good to all others. It's the 42 laws of ma'at. The dark side of the wall. These examples make the point that our knowledge of the ancient Egyptian people on this side of the Great Wall of History is very extensive, but we know only very limited amounts of what happened on the dark side of the wall. For example, the Greek historian Herodotus, referred to as the father of history, also referred to as the father of exaggeration, for his 9-volume work written in the early 5th century BC, observed of Egypt that there is no country that possesses so many wonders, nor any that has such number of works which defy description. Herodotus is considered to be the starting point of Western historical writing, although the accuracy of his facts has often been doubted by modern scholars because they seemed to be laden with exaggeration. Didn't we just say that? However, archaeological finds have begun to show that this Greek chronicler was extremely accurate. Okay. For example, Herodotus had described the great city wall of Babylon as having buildings placed on top of it and yet still having enough space between for a 4-horse chariot to turn. This seemed unlikely to experts, but remains have been discovered indicating that the wall was of such a width. Thanks to the early scribes and historians like Herodotus, we have a rich knowledge of the last 5,000 years, but what do we know of cultures that blossomed before this time? After 100,000 years of what is assumed to be virtual stagnation, humans began a completely new way of life in what is known as the Neolithic Revolution. It began approximately 12,000 years ago when people across the Middle East, Europe and Asia quite suddenly abandoned their nomadic hunter-gatherer existence and began to opt for permanent settlements. That must be all to do with agriculture, right? They began to cultivate rice, wheat, rye, peas, lentil and other plants and to domesticate animals such as cattle, sheep, pigs and goats. Technology also began around this time with the manufacture of pottery vessels for cooking and storing food, stone sickles and grinding stones to turn grain into flour. The term Neolithic means New Stone Age, and it refers to the time when the first farmers tilled the soil, planted, watered and harvested their crops and cared for their newly domesticated animals all the year round. In the British Isles, the Neolithic period can be said to span from approximately 6000 to 1500 BC. This new lifestyle was more labour-intensive than hunting and gathering, but also more certain, and it may be the case that the Neolithic Revolution was caused by the need to produce more food as a result of an increase in population. According to standard interpretations of the available evidence, the world had created the platform upon which civilization would eventually be built. But from our perspective, these early farmers were still very crude and unsophisticated. The author's perspectives. These early farmers were still very crude and unsophisticated because they existed on the dark side of the Great Wall of history. However, there was one Stone Age culture that appears to dramatically upset such a neat paradigm.